March 1242. Across the muddy plains of Hungary, a terrifying force that had struck fear across continents was pulling back to the east. These were the Mongols, unmatched horsemen who had crushed empires stretching from China to Persia. Only months before, they had devastated Hungary in one of the bloodiest campaigns in European history. Vienna, the center of Western Europe, was almost within their grasp. Yet, unexpectedly, they retreated. The pressing question remains, why would an undefeated army on the verge of controlling Europe suddenly abandon everything? For centuries, a simple answer was repeated, but modern research combining climate studies, archaeology, and military analysis paints a far more intricate and astonishing picture. Drop a comment to share where you're watching this from and what time it is in your location. I'm genuinely curious to see how far this story reaches. Today's narrative isn't merely about a dominant empire. It highlights how the course of history and the fate of an entire continent can be altered by forces beyond human control. To understand why the Mongol retreat was so significant, we must return to 1206. That year, a man named Temujin accomplished what many thought impossible. He united all the Mongol tribes under a single banner. Taking the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, he embarked on constructing the largest contiguous empire in history. Mongol strength was not solely based on ruthlessness. Their military system was exceptionally advanced. They could cover 100 kilometers in a single day, moving 3 times faster than European forces. On the battlefield, they communicated using signal flags and whistling arrows. Most crucially, they excelled in psychological warfare, striking fear as effectively as arrows. When Genghis Khan passed away in 1227, his third son, Ogedei, took the reins. Though not a strategist on par with his father, Ogedei understood the value of skilled leaders. Among them was Subutai, arguably the greatest military mind in Mongol history, who masterminded the European campaign. In 1235, Subutai presented Ogedei with an audacious strategy: attack Europe simultaneously on 5 fronts. Their aim was not mere plunder, it was conquest, extending all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. By 1236, roughly 150,000 Mongol cavalry crossed the Volga River, sweeping across Eastern Europe like a storm. Volga Bulgaria fell. The Russian principalities succumbed one after another. Kiev, the crown jewel of Kievan Rus, was utterly destroyed in 1240. Yet Subutai's ultimate target was Hungary. Why? Hungary was the gateway to Western Europe. Another factor was the Cumans, a nomadic people from the Russian steppes. When the Mongols attacked, about 40,000 Cumans sought refuge in Hungary. King Bela IV welcomed them, even claiming the title King of Cumania. To the Mongols, this act was a declaration of war. In late 1240, Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, sent Bela an ultimatum: surrender unconditionally or face total destruction. Bela remained silent. Europe was about to face a storm. In March 1241, 3 Mongol forces entered Hungary from separate directions. This was classic Subutai: divide and conquer, then reunite for the decisive strike. Ogedei Khan and Subutai led the main army through the heavily fortified Verek Pass, annihilating Count Dean's Tamasese troops within hours. European witnesses described the assault as lightning fast. King Bela had attempted preparation, ordering dense natural fortifications along the eastern border, but the Mongols had specialized engineers who cleared these barriers in 3 days. Meanwhile, a separate Mongol force advanced into Poland to divert attention. On April 9, 1241, at Legnica, they confronted a coalition of Poles, Moravians, and Templar Knights led by Duke Henry II. The battle showcased Mongol tactics. Feigned retreats and false attacks repeatedly drew heavy European cavalry out of formation. Black smoke created confusion, and once the enemy faltered, the Mongols encircled and destroyed them. Henry II was killed, his head mounted on a spear and paraded through the city, while 9 sacks of ears were collected from the fallen. But this clash was only a distraction. The main fight was in Hungary. On April 10th, the Hungarian army, estimated between 60,000 and 100,000 soldiers, reached the Sayo River near Mohi. They outnumbered the Mongols 2-1. Confident, Bela believed victory was near. That night, Mongols attempted to cross the bridge but were repelled by Hungarian crossbowmen. The Hungarians assumed they had won and left the bridge lightly defended to celebrate. A fatal miscalculation. At dawn on April 11th, Mongols attacked again, now supported by catapults hurling incendiary bombs, a gunpowder technology imported from China. This frontal assault was a mere distraction. Subutai had led 30,000 horsemen on a flanking maneuver during the night, crossing the river at a ford and building a temporary pontoon bridge. As the sun rose, Subutai appeared behind Hungarian lines. Bela suddenly realized his army was being surrounded and ordered a retreat to the camp. But the camp was poorly organized, cramped with tents and wagons that hindered movement. From a nearby hill, Ogedei Khan observed and remarked, "They are crowded like cattle in narrow stalls with no space to maneuver." The Mongol strategy was flawless. The Hungarian army was trapped in a perfect execution of divide, encircle, and annihilate. The Mongols began hurling incendiary bombs into the Hungarian camp, filling the air with smoke and flames. Panic spread among the defenders, and then Subutai executed the tactic he was most famous for. He intentionally left a gap in the encirclement. Seeing this opening, King Bela foresees a chance to escape and fled. When the Mongols did not pursue him, the entire Hungarian army abandoned their weapons and rushed through the opening. This was exactly what Subutai intended. Once the Hungarians left their camp in disorder and their formation shattered, Subutai gave the signal. Mongol cavalry struck from all directions. Thomas of Split, a historian who witnessed the aftermath, described it. When the Mongols saw that their enemies were exhausted from fleeing, unable to extend their arms to fight or their legs in flight, they rained spears upon them from every side and cut them down with swords, sparing no one, slaughtering them like animals. Left and right they fell like winter leaves. The ground was covered with their lifeless bodies, and blood flowed like a river. In this massacre, approximately 60,000 Hungarian soldiers perished, including nearly all the kingdom's nobility and military leaders. King Bela survived only because of his brave bodyguard and Ogedei Khan's order to capture him alive. Bela fled to Austria, but Duke Frederick, instead of aiding him, imprisoned the king and demanded an enormous ransom. In the months that followed, the Mongols systematically ravaged Hungary. They seized the royal seal from the body of Bela's vice-chancellor and forced captured Hungarian clerks to issue a forged proclamation in the king's name, instructing people to remain in their homes and assuring them that the king would soon counterattack. This clever deception allowed the Mongols to move freely across the countryside, slaughtering thousands. By the end of 1241, between a quarter and half of Hungary's population, possibly up to 500,000 people, had been killed, marking one of the most devastating humanitarian disasters of the Middle Ages. During the winter of 1241 to 1242, Europe was gripped by terror. News of the disaster at Mohi spread rapidly, and people whispered horrific stories about the Mongols. They were called barbarians, supposedly without religion, and even accused of cannibalism. In reality, the Mongols were not cannibals and tolerated the religions of their captives. Yet in the minds of 13th century Europeans, they were associated with Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic forces described in the Bible. Even the name Tatars or Tartars, originally referring to nomadic peoples of central Russia, came to include the Mongols. The connection to hell was clear. Tartarus, in ancient belief, was the realm of punishment. In 1241, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II expressed hope that the Mongols would be cast down into Tartarus itself. Fear alone, however, could not replace preparation. European kingdoms struggled to coordinate. Pope Innocent IV called for a crusade against the Mongols, but it failed to gain sufficient support. King Bailiff sent letters pleading for help to the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of France, but no serious assistance came. Many simply did not grasp the threat. Meanwhile, the Mongols prepared their next campaign. By winter 1242, they had crossed the Danube, the last natural barrier. Scouts penetrated deep into Bohemia, reaching Vienna itself. Ogedei Khan's forces swept into Austria, Dalmatia, and Moravia, brutally massacring populations wherever they met resistance, and conscripting men into Mongol military service where there was none. Vienna, a wealthy and cultural hub of Europe, lay directly ahead. Beyond it was Western Europe, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. Nothing stood in their path except one unforeseeable event. On December 11th, 1241, in Karakorum, the Mongol capital over 8,000 kilometers east of Hungary, Great Khan Ogedei went hunting. That evening, he drank heavily with friends. Ogedei had a notorious reputation for alcoholism. His brother Chagatai had even assigned an official to monitor his drinking, yet Ogedei still found ways to consume large amounts. That night, he reportedly vowed to reduce his intake, only to order cups twice as large the next day. At dawn, he died, likely from a stroke or organ failure caused by excessive drinking, though rumors of poisoning also circulated. Mongol law required that, upon the death of the Great Khan, all princes return to Karakorum for a kurultai, the council to elect a successor. This law, however, proved impractical. By early 1242, news of Ogedei's death reached the Mongol commanders in Hungary. Contrary to Subbutai's advice, they chose to retreat. For centuries, this was a standard explanation. It seems logical at first glance, but a closer look reveals complications. First, the timing did not align. Ogedei died in December 1241, while the Mongol retreat began in March 1242. A messenger would have needed 3 to 4 months to travel from Karakorum to Hungary, even under ideal conditions. Historian Rashid al-Din, consulting Mongol sources, wrote that Ogedei Khan only learned of Ogedei's death after he had already reached Kiev, nearly a quarter of the journey home. Second, Ogedei Khan never actually returned to Mongolia. He stayed in southern Russia, consolidating his power as leader of the Golden Horde and avoiding the kurultai due to a feud with Gayuk, Ogedei's son. He feared political danger if he went to Karakorum. So if Ogedei's death alone did not explain the retreat, what did? A 2016 study published in Scientific Reports provided a groundbreaking answer. Scientists analyzed tree rings from the Austrian Alps and the Romanian Carpathians, which record annual climate conditions. They discovered that from 1238 to 1241, Europe experienced unusually warm and dry summers, ideal for Mongol cavalry that relied on grasslands for their horses. Hard, dry ground allowed rapid movement, and European soldiers at Mohi had suffered under the heat. However, in early 1242, the climate changed suddenly. Summers became cold and wet, and heavy rains turned the Hungarian plains into a massive swamp, making rapid cavalry movements nearly impossible. At first glance, this might seem like a minor weather change, but for a nomadic army entirely reliant on cavalry, it was catastrophic. The marshy terrain reduced available pasture for horses, which were the backbone of the Mongol military. Each cavalryman needed several mounts, usually 5 to 7, with an army of 40,000 men. That meant between 200,000 and 280,000 horses, all of which required daily grazing. With the grasslands flooded, the horses starved. The mud also crippled mobility, which had been the Mongols' greatest advantage. Their light cavalry, designed for speed and precision, became cumbersome in the swampy ground. Lightning-fast encirclements and sudden raids, tactics that had won battles across Europe, were no longer possible. Perhaps most critically, the army faced a severe food problem. Hungary had already been ravaged for a year. Between 25 and 50% of the population had been killed, settlements destroyed, and farms abandoned. There was no one left to provide food for such a massive force. Researchers concluded that these relatively small climatic shifts from 1241 to 1242 were enough to fundamentally alter the conditions that had enabled the Mongols' initial success. The new environment made sustained occupation impossible, forcing the army to withdraw. Yet even this explanation is incomplete. For centuries, the story of the Mongol invasion has been told from the perspective of the conquerors. Hungary was crushed, Europe was defenseless, and only the death of Ogedei Khan saved the continent. Recent studies, particularly by Hungarian historians, reveal a far more nuanced narrative, one of resistance and cost. While the Mongols decisively won the Battle of Mohi, the post-battle situation was far more complex. One major Hungarian weakness in 1241 was the lack of stone fortifications. Kings Bela IV and his predecessors had prohibited nobles from constructing private castles, fearing decentralized power and a strong aristocracy. Consequently, most defenses were made of wood, clay, and earth, which crumbled under Mongol siege engines. But some stone castles did exist, and there the Mongols encountered serious difficulties. Cesnek Fortress in Croatia, where King Bela IV took refuge, withstood the Mongol siege. Other fortifications across Hungary fared similarly. While Mongol cavalry excelled in open battles, they struggled with prolonged sieges. After the Hungarian army officially collapsed, a guerrilla resistance arose. Members of the royal retinue who had survived, alongside armed peasants, harassed Mongol forces through ambushes, attacks on supply trains, and occasional skirmishes. Hungarian historians argue that this collective resistance, largely absent from Western chronicles, significantly slowed the Mongol advance, raising the cost of every conquest. Then there was Vienna. As a large, wealthy, and well-defended city, it posed a formidable challenge. Duke Frederick II of Austria, despite having imprisoned Bela IV earlier, was an able commander. He rallied heavy knights and adapted to Mongol tactics, employing active defense rather than waiting passively for a siege. In the fall of 1241, Frederick defeated Ogedei Khan's forces in several engagements along Vienna's outskirts, from Wiener Neustadt to the River March. While these battles were not decisive, they demonstrated to Ogedei Khan that further advancement would not be simple. Western Europe, too, was better prepared than Hungary. Populations were larger, defenses stronger, and fortifications more developed. Recent archaeological evidence shows that Mongols suffered far higher casualties in Hungary than traditional sources reported. Each defended fortress, guerrilla ambush, and battle around Vienna drained manpower and resources. Ogedei Khan faced a difficult strategic choice: press on into Western Europe with a weakened army, in challenging weather and against prepared defenders, or consolidate gains and regroup for future campaigns. The arrival of news regarding Ogedei's death further complicated matters. The Mongol withdrawal was not caused by a single factor, but by the convergence of multiple pressures. Ogedei's death created a political crisis. The empire lacked a clear succession system, and every great Khan's passing risked civil war. Ogedei Khan, while not returning to Mongolia, needed to protect his position and could not stray too far from power for long. Climate change transformed Hungary from a favorable staging ground into a logistical nightmare. The swampy terrain, starving horses, and scarce supplies made long-term occupation impossible. Military resistance further increased costs. Guerrilla attacks in Hungary, stone fortresses, and the potential for stronger defenses in Western Europe meant that every advance came at a steep price. The Mongols, though formidable, were not invincible. They could win battles, but sustaining control over conquered territories under these conditions was uncertain. Finally, some historians suggest that the Mongols may have already achieved their main objective. The primary aim of the invasion might not have been total conquest of Europe, but rather punishment of the Cumans and those who had sheltered them, particularly Hungary. With that goal accomplished, the remaining risk and effort of a full-scale European invasion outweighed the potential gains. If that is true, then once Hungary was completely devastated, the Mongols' mission could be considered complete. Their objective, Punishing those who had aided the Cumans and demonstrating their unstoppable power had been achieved. Subutai, the brilliant master strategist, certainly advised continuing the westward advance. He understood that this was a once-in-a-millennium opportunity, the chance to conquer Europe in its entirety, bringing the continent under Mongol rule as they had done with Russia, Persia, and parts of China. But Ogedei Khan and the other princes refused, not out of fear, but after careful calculation. They assessed the risks, weighed the costs, and made a conscious decision to withdraw. This is an important lesson about how history works. Major historical decisions rarely arise from a single cause. They are the product of multiple intersecting forces: political, environmental, military, logistical, and even psychological. By the spring of 1242, Mongol forces began to retreat eastward. They left behind a Hungary in ruins. King Bela returned from his refuge in Croatia to face a scene of devastation. Cities reduced to ashes, villages burned to ground, fields abandoned, and a population decimated by a quarter to half. The scale of destruction was unimaginable, yet Bela did not surrender to despair. He had learned an expensive but crucial lesson about preparation, defense, and resilience. Over the next 3 decades, Bela transformed Hungary into a fortress. He launched one of the largest castle-building programs of the Middle Ages. By the end of his reign, Hungary had nearly 100 new stone castles, compared to just 10 in 1241. These castles were strategically placed, designed to withstand siege engines, and capable of housing both soldiers and civilians during attacks. Bela also reformed the military, emphasizing heavy cavalry and crossbowmen, weapons that had proven effective against Mongol tactics. He encouraged new settlers, granting them conditional nobility in return for military service, fully equipped and trained. He even reached out to Venice to hire professional crossbowmen to supplement his forces. These reforms turned Hungary from a vulnerable kingdom into a formidable military power. The results of these preparations became evident 44 years later, in 1285, when the Mongols returned under the leadership of Ogedei Khan and Talaboga. They attempted to follow the same routes Ogedei Khan and Subutai had used decades earlier. But this time, they encountered a transformed Hungary. Stone castles now blocked their advance, and towns had fortified defenses. Local populations had stockpiled food and implemented scorched earth strategies to deny invaders sustenance. King Ladislaus avoided open battles, instead relying on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and the natural difficulties of the terrain to wear down the enemy. Talaboga, commanding the main force in northern Hungary, became trapped in the heavy snows of the Carpathians. His army suffered immensely from logistical failures, primarily food shortages, which killed thousands of soldiers. Some chroniclers even mention outbreaks of disease that further weakened the Mongol forces. Eventually, the invaders retreated without achieving any of their objectives. Hungary had survived, stronger and wiser for the trials it had endured. On a broader scale, the Mongol withdrawal of 1242 had profound consequences for Europe. Had the Mongols continued, the entire continent could have faced subjugation similar to what happened in Russia, Persia, or northern China. The withdrawal spared Western Europe from potential catastrophe. Later European chroniclers, particularly Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, a Franciscan friar who visited the Mongol court in 1246, interpreted these events as a divine miracle. Carpine wrote that God had orchestrated the death of the great Khan to protect Latin Christendom. Yet, as we now know, the reality was far more complex, and in many ways, far more interesting. It was not a miracle, but the result of an intricate combination of geopolitical considerations, climate change, human resilience, and strategic decisions. What lessons can we draw from this episode? First, no power is truly invincible. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire in world history, had its limits. These limits were not solely military. They were logistical, environmental, and political. Even the most disciplined and feared army in history could be constrained by the natural world and by the complex realities of governance and supply. Second, preparation matters. King Bela IV's catastrophic defeat in 1241 was not inevitable. It was a result of inadequate preparation. But over the next decades, he learned from his mistakes, fortified his kingdom, and transformed Hungary into a state capable of resisting even the most formidable military power of the era. The difference between the first and second Mongol invasions was not luck, but careful planning, preparation, and adaptability. Third, resilience is powerful. Hungary lost between 25 and 50% of its population. Its cities were destroyed, the economy was in ruins. And yet the kingdom recovered. Slowly, painstakingly, and at great cost, the Hungarian people rebuilt their homes, farms, and communities. Their recovery demonstrates the extraordinary capacity of human societies to endure, adapt, and emerge stronger from disasters. Fourth, the environment shapes history in ways we often underestimate. History is not only shaped by kings, generals, and armies, but also by climate, geography, and natural conditions. A wet, cold summer in 1242 turned the Hungarian plains into a swamp, halting the Mongols' cavalry and changing the course of European history. Environmental factors can be as decisive as human decisions in determining outcomes. Finally, history is rarely simple. For 8 centuries, the story of the Mongol withdrawal was simplified. The Mongols retreated because Ogedei Khan died. It was a tidy, memorable explanation. Easy to teach, easy to understand. But recent research, incorporating climate data, archaeological findings, and overlooked sources, shows that the reality was far richer and more complex. Multiple forces, climatic, political, military, and individual, interacted to shape the outcome. History is fascinating not because it provides simple answers, but because it reveals the interplay of countless factors, illustrating how unpredictable events, human choices, and environmental conditions converge to influence the fate of nations and continents. On a spring day in 1242, along the muddy roads of Hungary, a unique historical opportunity vanished. Subutai, the greatest strategist in Mongol history, who had personally commanded over 60 victories, looked west one final time. He knew the Mongols would never again come so close to the heart of Europe, and he was right. If they had continued, if the weather had remained dry, if Ogedei had lived longer, or if Balafur had been better prepared in 1241, the course of European history could have been entirely different. Yet, in the gap between what actually happened and what might have happened, we find one of the most compelling stories in human history. It illustrates how chance, environment, human decision-making, and resilience all converge to shape outcomes. For Europe, Hungary, and the Mongols, the 1242 withdrawal was a defining moment. It shows that even the mightiest armies can be constrained, that preparation and adaptability matter, and that ordinary people, through resilience and ingenuity, can shape history in profound ways. If this story has offered a new perspective on one of history's critical turning points, take a moment to reflect on the lessons it teaches. Every historical event is layered with complexity, and understanding these layers gives us a richer appreciation of the past.